I think if you take up gardening, it's just a magical moment, you know, when you have your first harvest. It's a magical moment, and you'll never go back. It'll be the best food that you'll ever taste. There's no doubt about it. Your own food is always the best food. It's not just the taste, it's something a lot deeper than that. My name is Jack First, and we're living in North Wales, not too far from Portmaddock actually. I grow food because I think it's a natural thing to do. I think when you think about it, all other animals, they have to provide food for themselves, their families, etc. I just feel that I need to do that as well. That's a part of me of getting back to nature. As a child, I had a vegetable patch. I've always been into gardening. They call me green fingers. And very fortunately for me, my father had a distant cousin whose brother had a farm in Belgium. So I spent my 6 weeks in Belgium working on his farm. This was in 1966. And I was absolutely hooked on it. There was something about that lifestyle. I was just totally hooked. When I finished schooling, I did a few years practical experience on farms, and then I went into farming. But most of my working life has actually been in horticulture. I've run a few horticultural projects, for instance. I've grown food. When I was working in a whole food cooperative, I was supplying the food there. I was actually a Soil Association symbol holder for some 10 years. So yeah, I've been there. I've done it now. I'm with the soil, 100% with the soil. I suppose if you want to go a bit deeper, you know, you could say to me, everyone's asking the question, where did we come from? And for me, it's very simple, and this might seem very simplistic. It's through food. Where's the food come from? The soil. Sunshine, rain, earth, wind and fire. I can't see us coming from, like I say, some water with hydroponics and some chemicals running through and all the rest of it. No, for me, no, I don't want to know. Now, with gardening, it's an incredible hobby. It's, like I said, everybody should be doing it. But, you know, it's possible to produce a pound of potatoes, let's say, for 10p, and it's also possible to produce them for 10 pounds. You know, and I think they have to have a balance there with how much you're spending. And one way of getting over that is recycling. You see the greenhouse in the back there and my frames, it's all recycled material. 99% of it is recycled. I've spent very, very little, and that's part of my training, as it were. If you've got the money, everything looks aesthetically, maybe looks, a nice greenhouse might look better, but to make your own, it obviously saves a lot of money. So the reason I've got a bit of a protection around the cucumbers, they've got full light, as it were, because they're not inside. It's because they don't like their leaves to be blown about, you know, so it's just a bit of protection. And there's quite a few things, all the, you know, pumpkins, squashes, courgettes, cucumbers and the like, and a lot of vegetables don't like having their leaves blown about. So you give what protection you can, but try and give them as much air as possible, as much light as possible. Because I think what a lot of people don't realise is that in a greenhouse, you don't get 100% light. It might only be 95, 90%. In a dirty polytunnel, for instance, or in some structures, it might only be 70 or 80% light. And that's an important factor in producing veg, especially in areas where there's poor light. Now, I worked in Keighley, up the Aire Valley there in Yorkshire, where on average there's only 3.5 hours of sunshine a day. Whereas down on the south coast there are areas where there's 5.5, 6 hours. They got twice the amount of sunlight. So the old lampshades, okay, what it does is it's shelter, it's protection, and it's increasing the amount of heat the seedlings are getting, gives a bit of protection. If you have a problem with mice, for instance, mice are opportunistic. They will go in, grab something and go off again. They're not going to start going around in circles looking for a way in when there's so many predators about. So it's something to deter. You can start a lot earlier because, just for instance, if someone starts out in the open sowing, say in April, there's actually something like, I think, 300 hours of daylight in April. You've lost it if you start at the end of April. So start at the beginning of March and you've gained 600 hours. That's how it is. You use the light. Like I said, I worked a lot in Yorkshire. A lot of the houses there are made of stone. They might have small yards. poor light, as I've said, in an environment ideal for slugs and snails. And some of my students in the past, I'd see them a couple of years later and they said, well, they've given up, there's too many slugs and snails about. So this is a system whereby you get a table, in this case I've just shown an old wheelbarrow. You get an old table, 4 legs, you stick them in buckets of water with salt in it. It has to be sturdy, and you can just grow on top of there, and you can be, as you can see, slug free. Also, if you're off the ground in some shaded areas, you can bring your produce into the light. You can put it at any height that's convenient for anyone that's in a wheelchair. When I studied agriculture, I've always had a hobby since those days of collecting old books. I just feel that there was greater depth in those years. So I came across a passage in one of my books referring to the Romans. As you know, they invaded Egypt, and they came across food growing in piles of manure. The system at that time was that they had manure, it gave off heat. They didn't know why at that time why it gave off heat. Then they must have put some compost, they had some compost on top. They put some kind of frame around there, and then they actually cut a rock called talc, as in talcum powder, which is opaque. So the manure heated up the compost, which heated up the air within this frame, which was kept in by this translucent sheet of talc. And then I got into it a bit, then I found the French, who since the sort of 16th, 17th century, up until the First World War more or less, were growing absolutely incredible crops, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. So I had a go at it. When I was working on a project in Keighley, we had 5 allotments, a community project as it were, and I did this on a large scale. It was successful. The Gardeners'World team came along and filmed us, eventually wrote a book. All I can say is this: I've used all sorts of systems, and for me hotbeds is the pinnacle, because you can start very early in the season and finish early. It doesn't. You can have the most awful ground that you can imagine, but you might have grade 5 ground, but it's as if you're working on grade 1 ground. If you're working in winter and spring, you don't suffer any of the summer diseases or pests. For instance, you're beating the life cycle of the carrot fly and other injurious pests. Hotbed will allow you to, regardless of your soil conditions, regardless of the environment, the temperatures, it gives you the opportunity of making a start. So the earliest I've started is in January. And the reason I was starting in January, because I studied the French methods, and they were actually producing well before January. Cropping in maybe late February, I've done that before. Certainly in March. It's a system that will allow you to produce food from late February right the way through the season, right through to October perhaps. And then you have an exceptionally rich compost. I've had analysed, and it's almost like a fertiliser. Maybe a third of it is saved and is used as the growing medium for the following year's hotbed. The rest of it is a top dressing for on your beds or in the garden or whatever, or even potting compost. You can turn it into a potting compost. So what drew me in the first place to hotbeds and the French, they're very, very clever. Typically they'd have a hotbed and they put 4 crops in there in the same piece of ground: radishes, lettuces, carrots and cauliflowers. So they had 2 salads, a root crop and a brassica, all in the same ground at the same time. The French were exporting all over France, of course, and England and beyond. They were turning stuff out left, right and centre. The hotbed is the most productive, there's no doubt about that. The gentleman by the name of Mr. Mackay, he couldn't understand why all this produce was coming over to England when all we could produce was a couple of turnips. So he went over to study what was going on, and in particular he found a market garden, a French market garden. It was just 2 acres and 7/8 of an acre, under 3 acres. But it was producing something like 37 tonnes per acre. And what's more, he said he could give examples by the dozen. That wasn't an isolated case. Everybody was producing that kind of produce, and that was at a time, it could be said that our varieties that we've got now growing now, using now, are more favourable. They're more, maybe perhaps higher yielding. So if they had had some of our technology then that we have now, and some of the varieties, just imagine what the yield would be. So I would say we're eating something almost all the year round out of the garden. Even in the smallest space, you get yourself a hotbed, you can save yourself an enormous amount of time, energy expense. When I say a small hotbed, 6 foot by 6 foot, even 5 foot by 5 foot, you'll be able to provide most of your salads throughout the season. So that's what drew me to it, understanding these yields. I couldn't believe it, so I had to do it myself.
I really hope that you enjoyed that video about Jack and his garden. He's a real pioneer when it comes to making hotbeds accessible to us gardeners. They're such a fantastic tool in order to eliminate the hungry gap. He's written a book about hotbeds, but I'm really excited to announce today the launch of a collaboration with Jack. We've created an online video course called Hotbed Masterclass, and it's going to show you exactly step by step how to build, fill, sow and make the most of your first ever hotbed. Just imagine the possibility of being able to harvest crops in March, April and May that you usually wouldn't harvest until about June or July, even in a polytunnel. Hotbeds, I think if you've just got one space, even if it's 5 by 5 foot, and there's only one type of growing method you can use, I would absolutely recommend a hotbed. It's really going to help you produce a huge amount of food from a small space. As well as the main video lessons and write-ups and additional resources, we've also had a 115-year-old book all about hotbeds, and it's one of the most inspiring things that I've ever read. We've had that turned into an audiobook, which is included as a part of the course just to give you a lot more fantastic insights and inspiration. Head on over to hotbedsuccess.com for our low-cost, high-impact course to show you how you can take your biggest step yet in terms of self-sufficiency.